Now stay tuned to the end of this video because I do have some thoughts and feedback and improvements for this build altogether, and I want to tell you guys how I actually lost the watch. I got new parts from Namoki and they're calling it their IWC Ingenieur, and it's pretty much a one-for-one copy of the IWC Ingenieur. They're not hiding this. In fact, they're encouraging us to like this type of build, to assemble it for ourselves. And when they asked me to see if I would be interested in putting the watch together, I of course took the opportunity because the value that I have in getting these parts, assembling it, and then giving you guys my feedback and giving you guys some tips and tricks along the way is what I value the most. So let's take a look at what we have for this build and see what we come up with. Now, the first thing that I would say you need to do when you're assembling a watch, especially when it comes to an automatic watch, you want to test the movement. So the first step that I always give is put it up on a time grapher. Now, some people like to test their movements and they have different apps on their phones, but I personally have never used this, and I've always used a time grapher to give me that kind of feedback. And the purpose of that is to make sure that the movement that you're receiving is healthy before you assemble everything else around it and then have to change out that movement in the long run. So I would say give that movement a nice wind, and if you could, maybe even let it run for about 24 hours. This way all of the oils could settle in. The watch has a break-in period where it's going to be running a little bit more evenly, but if you're anything like me, you're not going to wait for that. And if you get a readout in the very beginning that's pretty decent, I'm going to jump in. So after making sure that all the components within the movement is working at a healthy rate, I would recommend seeing if that date wheel is going to turn over naturally. You want to pull the crown out to 2 positions and act as if you were turning those hands over, and just make sure that date wheel turns over on its own. This way you know that it is in fact running. So after those 2 things are done, you could pretty much put the movement to the side because you want to prepare now the dial to have it put onto the movement itself. Now in the past, I've prepped my dial in very different ways. You'll see in my older videos, I used to lay the dial face down onto a pad, and then I'd remove those dial feet or pillars or whatever you want to call them. They normally come with 4 and you only need 2 to put into the movement. And I used to do this while it's resting on the face of the dial to the pad. Now I no longer do that. I actually just hold the dial on its sides and then I wiggle those feet with pliers or whatever tool that I have to remove the ones that I don't need. And then I also hold the dial suspended in the air as I file down those little nubs that are underneath it. Now that part is important because after you break off the feet that you don't need, and the way that you know which ones you are supposed to remove is by lining it up with the movement, seeing where those holes are, and then knowing which dial feet you need to keep and which ones you need to remove. But after you break them off, you also have to file them down, because the last thing you want is for that nub to rest onto the movement where now the dial is not flush with the actual movement itself. And that's gonna inevitably foul the hands and not give them enough room for you to place them on top. So after now you've clipped off the feet, you file them down, it's time to put that dial onto the movement itself. So making sure that you press down in a firm manner, but making sure that they're lined up accurately before doing so is rather important. And you want to take your time when you're putting those dial feet inside the movement, because if you do in fact scratch the date wheel, you can either break it or scratch off one of the numbers. So just take your time, line those feet up. When they gradually go in, you can then apply pressure, and I would only apply pressure towards the outside of the dial, keeping your fingers away from anything in the center where you're not going to interfere with the applied logos, the indices, or anything of that nature. So you now have the dial flush to the movement. Now, I always take the opportunity as much as I can to clean off the dial even before I case it. This way, along the way of me assembling, I'm constantly removing dust. It's just something that I'm used to doing. You may want to save all that for at the end of your build before you case the watch, but at the end of the day, even when we're doing those filings of the feet behind the movement, I want to make sure that all those dust particles or pieces of metal are away from my movement before I do an interaction from the dial to the movement itself. So you got your dial on the movement. Now you want to put the hands on. Now in this case, we do have a date wheel aperture, so we have to make sure that we're lining those hands up at the 12 o'clock, reenacting like that 12 a.m. type of feel before we actually move forward with the full installation of the hands, because that's important. You want that date wheel to turn as close as you can to that 12 a.m. mark, but keep in mind that it's very difficult to get that point very exact. I usually use it as a plus or minus 5-minute tolerance when it comes to that date wheel flip over, because I don't want to drive myself crazy, and getting them to be perfect is actually really difficult. So again, you want to make sure you have that temporary crown. That way you can manipulate the hands. The moment the date wheel switches over, you know that that's at 12 a.m. You could start installing the hour hand. After you get that hour hand down and it's flush enough where it's sitting all the way down as close as it can to the dial without it fouling the actual indices, you'll be ready for the minute hand. Now, I would test that hour hand before you move forward and try to install the minute hand. So at the end of the day, you're gonna push that hour hand all the way down. Make sure that it's not fouling the indices, and the way that you could do that is give it a 24-hour turn around the dial back to when the date wheel is going to adjust again, and this way you know you've made all your clearances for everything else that's on the dial. After which, you're ready for your minute hand. Go ahead and install that right over the hour hand. Now, when you install the minute hand, you want to make sure that, again, you're leaving space from the minute hand to the hour hand. You don't want it to be sitting up too high, because then you won't be able to install the second hand, and you don't want it to be too low, because then it'll foul the actual hour hand. So kind of eyeball it. You want to make sure after every time you press down the minute hand, you're lifting the movement up and you're making sure that you can visibly see that the two hands clear each other, and making sure that that hour and minute hand are not sitting in any weird angular positions. Another test that I like to do when I have the hour and minute hand installed, making sure that they're exactly on that 12 o'clock once that date wheel switched over, is I like to go for a 6 o'clock position. This way I can make sure that it's perfectly aligned at the 6 and at the 12 for that 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. position. And that way I know that they're pretty accurately straight onto the indices itself. Now, there's different ways that you can handle the hands. Some people like to use tweezers, some people like to use Rodico. There's different ways. But what I've found is when I use metal tweezers, you're more susceptible to scratching up the hands unless you're holding them at the side. But in order for you to be able to hold the hands at the side, you have to have really good finger dexterity and accuracy. So personally, I feel like Rodico is a lot easier without the risk of scratching the hands, but just keep in mind that if you use Rodico, there may be smudges towards the tip of the hand. As you guys can see, the position that I'm holding the Rodico with the hand tool. So I usually clean that off after the fact just to make sure that there's no smudges, and it just makes things a little bit easier. Lastly, you have the second hand, which is by far the hardest hand that you could put on a watch. It does take a lot of time. It's more of a feel. You can eyeball it if you have the right tools, but ultimately it's more of a feel, and it can take some time. And even with me assembling maybe 50 watches at this point, it still sometimes takes me longer, on some days more so than others. So my advice to you would be this. If you're not getting the hands on, and let's say you've been at it for 30 to 40 minutes with the second hand alone, it just keeps falling off, it's not turning after you push down on it, take a break. Make sure when you get frustrated, if you do get frustrated, take some time to just take a break and then go back to it later. Maybe you want to go back to it the next day. Because ultimately, once you get frustrated, you're going to try to force that second hand on, thinking that you just need to apply more pressure. But the truth is, you don't need to apply much pressure at all when you're installing a second hand. In fact, I often relate the amount of force that you would need to be the pressure of a full bottle of water. So if you're doing that and it's just not sitting on, it's just not seated correctly. So you want to take your time and make sure that you don't bend that second hand, because once you do, it's pretty much over. After all three hands are on, you're pretty much ready to have a case installation. But here are two things that you want to do prior, and it all has to do with cleaning. You definitely want to clean off the dial, and you definitely want to clean off the case. Now, you want to remove all the dust particles on top of the case, and you want to remove all the dust particles on your dial as well. And you want to make sure that that dust that's sitting even superficial on top of the case is in fact superficial. So I would remove everything, bring it up closely to a light source, and make sure that you remove everything before actually casing the movement. Because once you case the movement, The only way to go back in to remove that dust is to remove the actual movement itself, giving you a higher increased chance of having the hands fall off or just grabbing the movement in a wrong way and damaging things altogether. So less is more, and the less that you have to mess around with that movement in that case, the better. So just make sure you have a detailed cleaning before lining that up. So at this point, we're removing that temporary crown and stem, and we're casing that movement into the case itself. I usually have the movement at that point sit on a pad, and then I just press down the case into the movement and then flip it over and secure it a little bit more. Now, the key to this is just to make sure that you are lined up very steady and you don't foul any of the hands, especially the second hand. So you want to be sitting directly over the movement and then pushing down on it very slowly. Now, you don't have to push down on it all the way. You just have to get it in there enough where you can flip over that pad with the movement still on top of it. And then if it needs to be secure anymore, you can push the back of the movement on the edge of it where it's secured and away from anything fragile to make sure that it's all the way sitting inside of the case. Now, when you get that movement inside of the case, you're pretty much at the home stretch. The only thing left now is to take the stem and the crown, secure them together, making sure that you cut that stem to a proper size, so like that the crown could fit flush once you screw it into the case. Now, I have a whole bunch of pre-cut stems from other modifications, and if this is your first rodeo and you happen to cut a stem that's too short, I would keep that stem, because there's been several occasions where that stem that was cut too short for one mod fit perfectly for another one. And the NH35, all of the NH35 movements all use the same stem, and that's the most common one used. But if that's not the case for you, the easiest way to measure and cut, I would say, is to put the crown on that stem, put the stem inside of the case, and then with a measuring tool, measure out how much the bottom of the crown is away from the actual case itself. Once I find the proper size for that stem to fit the crown onto the crown tube, fully secured down when it's screwed in, that's when I like to glue the actual crown to the stem itself. Now, Namoki doesn't provide any glue. I end up using my own glue. That's probably the only purchase that you have to do outside of the tools if you do buy the tools from Namoki. And once you install that, you're ready to rock and roll. Now, for feedback for this build altogether, this is a little different than what I'm used to from Namoki. Being that this is an integrated bracelet, you pretty much are stuck with the bracelet that they provide. It's not something that you can swap out. In fact, I looked on AliExpress to see if they had some strap replacements for this actual build. Because the lug attachment is a male end link, you have to find a particular strap that wraps around it and fits that particular size. So if integrated butterfly clasps are not your thing, that's something to take into account. Now, another thing is in fact that it's a butterfly clasp. And when it comes to style of bracelet like this, I always say that you need to have a half link included with that bracelet to make sure you have a close fit and it fits around the wrist the way the user really needs it. I'm very particular when it comes to fitting my bracelets to my wrist, and when I have a butterfly clasp, I always make it a necessity to have that half link. And I think that even if Namoki has to charge a couple more bucks to include that to every purchase, that would be a humongous upgrade when it comes to this style bracelet. Another thing that I was surprised with the finish of this bracelet was it had a lot of sharp edges, and particularly around that button deployment clasp, which made it irritating when wearing the bracelet itself. I actually ended up getting my drum roll and shaving down the edges for that. This way it was a lot more smoother. And then even in the inside of the clasp itself, those were really, really sharp. But they don't really make contact because once you snap it closed, that part is not exposed to your wrist. But I shaved it down anyway because of how sharp it really was. And now it's definitely wearable after doing that with my drum roll. And finally, I had some issues with the crown this time. I'm actually really shocked. Namoki is usually on point when it comes to the quality of parts. But when I unscrew the crown and I screw it back in, I don't know if the tolerances have to do with the crown tube or the crown itself, but it sometimes catches and stops altogether and I'm not able to screw it in, which I have to back out the crown and then screw it back in order to make it flush and just catch onto the grooves naturally. And finally, how did I lose this watch? You're saying to yourself, Skylar, you're holding the watch in your hand. How could you have lost it? Well, right when I finished completing the modification right there on my bench, I turned around and showed it to my wife and she really liked it. In fact, she compared this watch to my Tissot PRX, stating that I already have a design like this in my collection. What do I need another one for? And then she let me know that she was interested to put it into her collection. And I can't pass up on an opportunity to add another watch to her collection, possibly getting her closer to being a watch enthusiast, because she already has a watch collection, but I'm working on making her a watch enthusiast. So this is now in her collection. It's part of her watch, and I'm more than happy to have her wear it. If you guys are interested in watch builds, I made a whole playlist dedicated to just watch customizations. So if you like that kind of content, check it out, and I'll see you guys there. Namoki not only supplied the parts to this IWC Ingenieur, but they also sent me parts to the next release that they're gonna have coming out. So I'll have that video out soon, and I'll give you guys my thoughts on that as well. But I appreciate you guys for spending your most valuable asset, which is time, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.